Welcome to Mindshift. I'm Brandon. Today is episode 4 of our newest series, Dissecting the Divine, in which we look at God, an Anatomy by Francesca Stavrakopoulou. I'm excited for today's chapter that we're going through. It's chapter 4, which is Sensational Feet. This is our last chapter on the feet before we move into what is a natural transition, if you can believe it or not, the genitals. So this is an important segue chapter, and there's two things I want to mention, then we'll just dive right in. First, if you want to buy the book or listen to it so that you can follow along, I have in the description listed below some affiliate links to the audiobook, the paperback, or the hardcover. We have lots of chapters yet to come, so it's not too late to get your copy of the book, and it helps out the channel. And second, also in the description is the entire playlist for all of the Dissecting the Divine episodes. You can watch these individually. Any given episode will stand on its own. However, there is a progression here, so I'd encourage you to go back and start at the beginning of the series if you have not. Other than that, let book club commence. So what are we talking about today? Sensational feet, and there's a second part of the chapter, foot fetish. We're wrapping up the feet section, and how does she start us off? She starts us off by just giving us kind of an overview of the ancient world in terms of the use, necessity, appreciation, etc. of feet. The uses for the feet back then are something that we have lost with our technology, and we are literally less grounded than we used to be. Let me read you a quick quote to kind of start us off. But our ancestors used their feet far more frequently to think with, to understand and manipulate the world in which they walked and worked, whether threshing and milling grains and seeds, treading fruit, herding animals, rolling manure for fire bricks and fertilizer, turning the potter's wheel, weaving textiles and baskets, or measuring distance and time. The world was experienced through people's feet in ways increasingly unfamiliar in the modern age. I think it's an important thing to kind of ground ourselves back in that understanding, as we can see with the biblical writers and their usage and writing about God's feet would have more import. She then goes on to show that even blessings and curses and prayers, etc., really revolved around feet, a steady path for us to walk, the avoidance of getting bitten, avoiding the slippery slope or the rocky way, etc. It's just inundated in our past writings, not just biblically, about the importance of where our feet go. In the same way, it's equally a curse. Many of the curses, spells, prayers against the enemy, etc., that we see biblically and non-biblically have to do with cursing the opponent's feet, that they would not be sure of foot, that they would not be fast, that they would be lame, that they would be hobbled, that they would be barefooted, etc. So we are at the beginning of this final chapter on the feet, rebuilding our case for the importance that the feet played in the ancient cultures. Then we get an interesting comparison. This is one of the things that hopefully you've noticed already she does quite well and quite often. She compares the Yahweh myth with other ancient myths, typically myths that predate Yahweh, but not always. And what I love about this is that it brings into correct focus the lens in which we should be viewing Yahweh. Just another mythology, just another piece of ancient lore. And so our first example comes from the Ugaritic text with Anet, or Anet, which was a warrior goddess. And I won't recite the whole story for you, but the main theme is that she loves trampling her enemies, walking through their bodies, feeling the blood on her feet, etc. Oh, how pagan, how gross, how horrific. Well, don't worry, Yahweh has his own example of this, and it is found in Isaiah. That's the Old Testament version, and then Jesus himself has a even more amped up version of this in Revelation. Let me read you the one from Isaiah, though. I'll start with what she says, and then she quotes the verse. A lookout in Jerusalem sees Yahweh marching back towards the city from an attack on the enemy kingdom of Edom, his clothing blotched with crimson stains. Why are your robes red and your garments like theirs who tread the winepress? Asked the sentry. I have trodden the winepress, Yahweh declares. I trod them in my anger and trampled them in my wrath. Their juice spattered on my garments and stained all my robes. Keen to ensure that his metaphor had not been misunderstood, the deity spells it out. I trampled down people in my anger. I crushed them in my wrath, and I poured out their lifeblood on the earth. This is a God who has felt the crunch of bones and skulls under his feet, the warm, wet mulch of human flesh around his ankles, and hot spray of blood on his legs. And again, Jesus recreates this metaphor for us in Revelation and takes it up a notch. So I love that. I love when we get a comparison, again, the predating myth to Yahweh, and then Yahweh is no different. He is a bloodthirsty war god who marches on his enemy and walks through bathing his feet in blood, which is a common sight that we get all throughout the Old Testament. Young, sweet David is making hymns about bathing his feet in the blood of his enemies, enemies should Yahweh give them into his hand. She then goes on after the myth comparison to talk about deities and their walking. And she gives many ancient myths where deities typically would walk to meet up with another deity, and that was kind of the euphemism for meeting or making love. She then compares that with, this is a strange distancing from what we typically see and the typical patterns that happened with the stories about the gods, to Yahweh, whose first encounter of walking happens in the garden, and he's walking with his creation, Adam. And we see that walking with God is akin to being in step with God. So Adam did it, Enoch, Noah, Abraham, these just men of God. They would get time with God. They would be in the presence of God, and it was to walk with God. So she explains those happenings in the Bible, goes into some detail about each of those four men and those encounters. She even gives a really unique verse. I feel like this is stuff that people, when they read the Bible, they don't pay attention to. It just kind of escapes them, but it's so strange. It's right here in our very own Bible. I'm going to read you as she quotes it in the book. This comes from Dut 23:12 through 14, I believe. Outside the garden, however, walking could be hazardous, and Yahweh was at risk of stepping in something unpleasant if he didn't take the necessary precautions. It is for this reason that he issued the Israelites traveling from Egypt to the Promised Land with special instructions for defecation. You shall have a designated area outside the camp to which you shall go. With your utensils you shall have a trowel. When you relieve yourself outside, you shall dig a hole with it, and then cover up your excrement, because Yahweh your God walks in your camp. That's an actual verse. I also want to know how long it is, how detailed it is, how he's giving them very precise instructions. Well, you're going to carry utensils anyways. When you do so, make sure you include a trowel. Why? Because I need you to cover this up. Why? Because I don't want to step in it. Like, can you imagine if Yahweh had given even this paragraph worth of attention to not molesting children, not enslaving people, how to be a good parent? Just one paragraph of practical, applicable advice that would actually increase well-being. But nope, we have to make sure that this mythological being does not step in shit. What a waste of words. We then move into the noisiness of gods as they walk along. It is, for instance, in the Garden of Eden, Adam hears the footsteps of Yahweh walking through the garden, and so he knows Yahweh has arrived and he should go and hide himself, because this is after he has realized his shame. Again, sometimes we picture this garden as like a couple trees and they're just sitting there. This would have been expansive, and hearing God enter the garden, regardless of where you are or where he is, especially since we have an admittance here of Yahweh saying, "Where are you?" like he doesn't know, because those all-knowing properties come much later in the Bible. But I digress. The point here is it makes a loud sound. And we'll talk about this more as we get to the end of this episode when we talk about the size of God's feet. But we read this about the noise of this particular God's footfall throughout many parts of the Bible. Specifically, we see it in Judges when he's marching on Edom. And maybe one of the best examples comes from 2 Samuel, and I'm just going to read you this part again from her book, so there will probably be a small introduction and then the verse itself. The noise of the god's footsteps might also function as a siren in the earthly realm, triggering holy war between nations and their deities. In the books of Samuel, an oracle instructs King David to listen out for the sound of the wind in the grove of trees before launching an attack on the Philistines. When you hear the sound of marching in the tops of the balsam trees, then be on the alert, for then Yahweh has gone out before you to strike down the army. I think it's so interesting just how interlaced Yahweh's feet have been into so many verses that we've read, and I haven't covered maybe even a fourth of the examples she's given so far in the last 3 chapters. This is why you need to get the book for yourself. I'm doing what I think is a pretty good high-level overview, but man, if this book is not just jam-packed with amazing, amazing information. I'm also cutting out a lot of the other sources that she draws from. She draws from some Gnostic sources, from some Jewish mysticism, and other things like this. I will mention when I do that, but so far I've avoided it because there's enough examples from what people consider canon to be effective anyways. She then goes on to the temper tantrums of gods that we see all throughout many myths, including in the Bible, when gods will stomp their feet when they are angry. And so their feet are also a sign of fury or vengeance. She then spends a pretty large chunk here that I'm just going to encourage you to read for yourself, where she covers the aspects of being barefooted, of ritual foot washing, of holy ground, and shoes as a symbol of power. We'll cover some of that as we get through the rest of this episode, but just example after example, myth after myth, it is just fascinating. Some of the myths myths, just as an example, though, that she covers as going through all of those points would be like Enlil, who kills off all mankind with a flood because he can't stand the ruckus, the noise of humans. Amun, who loved the silent ones. Even kind of bringing it into a strange place with an example of Socrates, who didn't believe in much in that realm, saying it feels like something holy is here, so shh, be quiet. In Ecclesiastes, we see guard your steps, also associated with being quiet. The verses that come right after that, I believe, are something to the extent of be careful with your words or be few with your words. And even gives an example, again, in history of Josephus, who talks about the law of purification that was found in front of the temples, both in Greek and Latin. And we have actual examples of that. So this idea of being quiet when you enter the holy, barefoot so as not to clobber your way in, and also an idea of cleanliness. And that cleanliness that was needed before entering the holy places is where we start to develop this idea of piety and cleanliness being next to godliness, etc. And we're going to see those themes extrapolated on in the New Testament with Jesus, which we're about to get to here. The last main thing that she covers before the second part is that of Moses and the encounter in front of the burning bush, taking off his sandals because he's on holy ground. Eventually that holy ground would be built into something else, and the people would still take off their shoes before going in as a sign of respect and reverence. And again, that's a pretty lengthy section. Then we're going to move into the second part of chapter 4, which is foot fetish. Many of you have already made jokes in the comments, and I have thought about making them myself. There is so much attention on God's feet here. It seems almost as if there is some sexual component, and you are not wrong. And that is why this particular section is the one that segues us into chapter 5, 6, 7, and 8, 4 chapters dedicated to the genitals of God. There's way more to say than I would have ever guessed, and it's amazing once you see it. This is our little preview here when we look at the sexualization of the feet. And not just in the Bible, but in society in general, but specifically in many of these ancient cultures. She starts us off with an example, a recent example, I think it was 2013, where Pope Francis, for the first time ever on the Easter tradition of washing and kissing feet, did it to 2 females instead of males. And it's supposed to symbolize what Jesus was doing for his disciples. So there was uproar. I can't believe it's not male. He's sexualized this. And really, it just goes to show the dangerous sexual activity that can happen and the sexual attractiveness of the female foot, when this was never in contention, when it was him kissing men's feet. And what is so funny to me is I get comments all the time. This is just a sidetrack here of, well, I was just raised in some fundamentalist cult. Don't you know Catholicism has all the answers? And then I hear things like this where the Catholics cannot even agree on if it is okay to include females into some of their rituals. Tell me again that it has all the answers, that I need to just rely on the early church fathers and church tradition and the revelation from the Pope, etc. Like, it's so silly to me, the things that become important. But yeah, it's me with my fundamentalist background that takes things too literally. Sure. So then we get into the example of Jesus washing the feet of the disciples, and she talks about some of the incorrect understandings that we have about that practice. A lot of people understand, and rightly so, that it was slaves in the day that would do this for their masters, which kind of desexualized it, because slaves were just there. That was their use, was to be of use to their master like another arm. They weren't regarded humanely enough for it to be considered a sexual act. But Jesus, a non-servant, a non-slave, doing this to people that on the hierarchy were lower than him, that's why it made such a big splash. But if you read what Jesus is telling his disciples, specifically Peter, as he's doing it, that you won't understand this until later. I have to do this for you to be with me. Jesus understood the purification rituals, and in saying that those who would be with him, the ones that were closest to him, had to have clean feet, even to the extent he would have to do it himself for them to be accepted in his presence, was deifying himself. At least that is the interpretation that Francesca Stavrakopoulou gives us. This is also a great time to point out that I understand she makes some assumptions, she has to make some leaps, some smart guesses, etc. I think they are all well placed, and they could be wrong, some of them. Some of them are in great scholarly agreement, and some she's kind of out on her own. And so I'm not trying to say everything she writes in here is gospel, this is the new Bible, she can't get it wrong, she has no bias, anything of this nature. Again, I am very impressed with the amount of notes that she provides in context in the back, as well as sources, etc., on how she arrived at these conclusions and these ideas. And she's also pretty good about saying what we can know for sure and what might just be a hypothesis, etc. So I'm aware of this. I want to make sure you guys are aware of it. I am talking about this like like everything in here is accurate because I'm sharing it with you, but I obviously am not a scholar that has gone through, checked all her work before presenting it. So caveat included. She then shows us some more biblical examples and now starting to include Jesus of the foot dynamics even in the New Testament. Walking on the water, this trampling of the water, is something we have seen in pre-existing myths as well. She talks about the followers of Jesus always worshiping, being at his feet, people that wanted healed, touching his feet, the power of a deity's foot, with this concept that, oh, the feet are the least of these. No, they're the most powerful. This is where you go to show reverence. This is where you go for healing. This is where you go to show you submit, that you follow. And then we get to the biggest example, which comes to us from Luke. This is of the woman. Sometimes it's regarded as Mary Magdalene, sometimes it is not, but she has come and she is just beside herself. She is crying and weeping on Jesus's feet. She is using her hair to dry his feet. She is anointing his feet with oil and rubbing his feet. And it is this very sexual act when you really look at it. We even see that called out within the story. The man, the Pharisee that Jesus is with, is so uncomfortable by this, and Jesus is fine with it. And most modern readers of the Bible have really dismissed the idea of a sexualized Christ, especially with all the hang-uppery on the genitals and private parts and what people do in their bedrooms and with whom and how, and all of this that the Bible has. It seems like, okay, no, Jesus, he's not married. There is no sexualization here. And if you go back and read that story, let me just explain it how she does. She bathes his feet with her tears and rubs them dry with her unbound hair, a style more usually seen publicly on women venerating the gods in a sanctuary or performing mourning rituals. Her flood of tears becomes a rain of kisses. She has not stopped kissing my feet, Jesus approvingly observes, while she anoints and massages his feet with a rich ointment. The ritualized nature of her actions is impossible to miss. She washes and anoints Jesus's feet as priests in the temple would wash and anoint the cult statue of a god, simultaneously acknowledging and marking its sacred status. But the intense sexuality of the scene also communicates an eroticism many have found discomforting, including the Pharisee in the story, which is shocked that Jesus let a sinful woman touch him in such a way. It is a scene emphasizing the overwhelming sensuous excess of her body by using her flowing hair, wet skin, and the repeated actions of her mouth and hands to caress Jesus's feet. Her actions take on the characteristics of a sexual stimulation or erotic play, as seen in visual and literary works across the contemporaneous Greco-Roman world. But what she is starting to set up here is, again, the eroticism associated with the feet, biblically speaking. We know that the feet are euphemisms for sex, most obviously in the story of Ruth and Boaz, where Ruth goes to the threshing room floor and she uncovers Boaz's feet. This is 100% a euphemism for genitals and or sex. She's at his feet all night, and then by the morning she has conceived. It wasn't his feet. I'm only going to read you one or two more things before the end of this episode, but I do want to read this one, and this is an example of all those other euphemisms that happen within the Bible, or some of them. Elsewhere in the Hebrew Bible, husbands wet their feet with or in their wives at home. Women's skirts are forcefully lifted up to expose their feet in public acts of sexual abuse and humiliation. Wanton women whose genitalia deserve to be shamefully exposed are those who jingle with their feet as they walk in sandals and anklets decorated with tiny bells. And adulterous women are those whose feet do not stay at home, but walk about the city by night and stand on street corners. It is hard to believe they're really in the Bible, and then sure enough, there they are. We get more proof from her that the feet were highly sexualized in these societies, these myths, these religions. And this time she gives us an Assyrian myth comparison from the 7th century BCE that sounds an awful lot like what we see in the Song of Solomon, where he is idolizing her feet and her legs. So she stays within that sexual realm of the feet, and she does then give examples all throughout the centuries of other people like bishops and church fathers and early apologists, etc., who also seem to have a sexual idea of Jesus's feet or God's feet. You'll just have to read the book to hear about those. How does the chapter end? It ends with a transition paragraph that is going to start getting us ready for the genitals talk that starts in chapter 5. Let me just read you this last paragraph and then we'll wrap up. The fetish of the divine feet was already a well-established feature of centuries of Jewish and Christian traditions. The medieval mystics contributing to the Zohar were simply drawing anew on rich biblical heritage of cosmic mythology in order to better understand the intimate relationship between God and humans. Deeply embedded within this mythology was the ancient idea that God had always been a sexual deity, and in the Bible, he had the genitals to prove it. And to reiterate, the purpose of why I'm sharing it is because, again, I think it just puts the Bible in its place. Ancient Southern Levantine mythology. Nothing new, nothing original, nothing supernatural. By removing the mysteries of the origin of this God and of this religion, we see it for what it is, another human invention. Thank you for following along. Thanks for being here. I'm testing out when I'm going to share these, maybe Friday afternoons, maybe Saturday mornings. We'll just see what happens. But until the next one, keep thinking. I wanted to personally thank my top tiers of support, my Iconoclast, GVI, Jacob, Jason, Joe, Oliver, and Shawn, my Humanist heroes, Jarrod, Karolina, and Kristi, my Atheist advocates, Anne, Elijah, Rokkit, Sparky, and Todd, as well as all of my secular scholar patrons. If you believe in the mission of this channel, or you just enjoy its content, please consider joining these fine patrons. Thanks, and have a great day.